Okay, so welcome everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Just before we get started, I'll just say one more time that we will go a little bit past the hour to make time for the questions that I'm sure that so many people will have at the end of this. We will be using the Q&A function to ask questions. And so if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the discussion. So why are we all here? We're all here because we know that workers taking mass action can force legislators to respect democracy, and we must be prepared to act if Trump refuses a peaceful transition of power. We as workers have learned firsthand that we have everything to lose and we have already lost so much. And so we can't afford to do any more givebacks, any more concessions, no more compromises with the ruling class. We really do need to put it all out there so that we can fight for our livelihoods, the livelihoods of our families, our loved ones, our neighbors, our comrades all across the country. And so this is serious business. We're 14 days out from the election, and we really got to get organized and start moving cohesively as much as possible. So I'm really excited about this call. This call is brought to us by the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, or otherwise known as EWOC, which is a joint project of the United Electrical Workers and the Democratic Socialists of America. And it came about in the time of COVID as a response to support workers organizing in their workplaces to win better conditions for themselves and their coworkers. It's been an amazing project. You'll hear from people tonight who have been helping to organize and also have amazing stories of workers coming together to win real demands and real change on the job as we're all facing a global pandemic and putting our lives on the line to go to work to keep the economy going. So we'll hear more about that later. I just want to quickly introduce our speakers, and I'll introduce myself first. For those of you who don't know, I'm Bianca Cunningham. I am from New York City, based out of Brooklyn. I formerly was a rank and file activist with Verizon Wireless, where I started a union with my coworkers, bargained a contract, went on a 49-day strike for our first contract and ended up getting fired from my organizing. And now I'm on staff at Labor Notes as an organizer and a writer, and I'm also a member of the NYC DSA. Our first speaker is Sara Nelson. Sara Nelson is the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, the CWA, currently leading her union in a fight to pass the stimulus bill, asking all members of Congress to agitate for a relief bill prior to the election. And she's been lifting up the hashtag Relief Now and hashtag Everyday Counts social media posts. We also have Zack Pattin. Zack Pattin is a fourth-generation waterfront worker and member of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union in Tacoma, Washington. And he currently serves on the steering committee of the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission of the Democratic Socialists of America's national labor body. Welcome, Zack. And last but not least, we have Dawn Tefft. Dawn was a co-president of her graduate workers union during the Wisconsin uprising, and after working as an organizer with faculty and grad workers around the country, is currently the staff organizer for the Graduate Workers Union, UIC-GEO, at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Welcome, Dawn. Thank you so much for all of you for being here tonight. So let's get into our first question. So the first question is, Trump has said that he won't leave office, implying that if he loses, he'd be willing to attempt to steal the election. What do you all think the role of workers would be if this happens? And what experiences have you had organizing with your coworkers, our union brothers and sisters and comrades, to disrupt the system and defend democracy? We'll start with you, Sara, on that question.
Okay, well, thanks, Bianca, first of all. And it's super exciting to be here with everybody tonight. Also, I'm just, seeing everybody pop into the chat there, and I'm thinking about all the organizers that we're going to have all around the country to organize millions of workers coming off of the shared experience of COVID and what we're about to go through with this election and what follows on after. So get ready, because 2021 is going to be a hell of a year and millions of people joining the labor movement. So so here we are, and I think that, you know, what we have learned in our workplace, and I think about flight attendants, and I think about flight attendants and what we normally do, which is de-escalate conflict, which in some ways is directly at odds with taking action and taking a stand. But we were confronted immediately with the chaos of this administration, with the Muslim ban. It was right in our workplace. And we had people who were taking off with one status and landing with another and having to explain to passengers what was going on in the middle of the flight when we didn't even know ourselves. And we had flight attendants who were taken into custody by ICE while they were landing after doing their job because of their own immigration status. And so we had to learn very quickly that we had to talk with our members around what the actions of this administration were going to mean for them. And we also learned very quickly that if we centered that conversation around Trump, that was an absolute loser. But if you centered it around how this is affecting people in their own lives and in their jobs, and around what they believe themselves is right and moral, that was an entirely different discussion. So by the time we got to the point of family separations, and the administration was actually using commercial aircraft to facilitate this evil policy, we had flight attendants who were willing to stand up and say, I'm not going to work flights that where kids are transported away from their families on our planes. And so we were very strategic about that. The public message was flight attendants were not going to work those flights. We took individual flight attendants who could describe that moral conflict for themselves, and we lifted that up for everyone to see and see their coworkers talking about that, so that we were defining the problem. You've got to define the problem for everyone, and especially in a moment of chaos where you've got to quickly organize everyone together around the same message, around a national message. You don't have the time to have all the union meetings that you would normally have to build power for a strike vote, right? You would normally take months or even a year to build towards that kind of consensus around what we're fighting for and what we're willing to do for it. So instead, we lifted up these stories of flight attendants who could define for themselves what this meant for them in their workplace, and other flight attendants could identify with that. And then we asked management in a very direct way, what are you going to do when these flight attendants say that they can't work these flights? And within 48 hours, we had all the major airlines telling the administration that they could not use our planes to facilitate this policy. And so we have real power, especially when we think about how we can control capital, right? So the target's not Trump. The target's the people who can control Trump. And that starts with us. And so if we understand that we have that, and we can organize around a common value that we have together, but not against the individual, but what we share as common value as workers, and we can have that discussion very, very quickly and lift that up and define what's at stake, then we can take action together, and we can actually move those in charge of capital to make decisions that can help put pressure to get the right response. So there's one example for you. I can give you a lot more. But.
No, that was great. Thank you. And I think that, you know, the messaging is something that we really need to work on here. I feel like this is why calls like this are so important, because you have all these conflicting messages about what do we feel about Biden, or are we going to say, you know, this about Trump? And so it's really important that the left gets on the same page with the work.
We matter, by the way. Biden doesn't matter. Trump doesn't matter. We matter.
There you go. That's the message, people. Take that. Okay. So the same question to you, Dawn. Give me some examples of you all defending democracy, and what do you think working people could be doing right now?
Well, I mean, I think the role of workers is to talk to their coworkers about taking all sorts of action, and that includes withdrawing their labor until the presidency is returned to the rightful winner. And if we're going to stop a fascist takeover, this is the window that we have to do so. After that, things become infinitely harder, so we have to do it now. And I come to this perspective through my experiences of the Wisconsin uprising. So in Wisconsin, Republican legislators proposed legislation that was intended to bust unions and eviscerate social services. And at the time, I was co-president of my grad union, MGAA, along with Lee Abbott, And when we heard about what was coming down the pipeline, and that had been engineered by Republican think tanks, and they were intending to pilot that in Wisconsin in order to roll it out in other union strong states in order to transfer power ultimately into the hands of oligarchs, we knew it would likely take more than protests to end that kind of plan. They weren't gonna just cave, right? Because we're out in the streets. And we agreed that mass strikes or even a general strike, if that were possible, would be necessary. And we asked the co-presidents of the grad union TAA in Madison to remotely meet with us. And we really emphasized what we saw as the horrors of what was coming down the pipeline and proposed that, you know, our unions both do strike assessments in preparation. And TAA eventually wound up holding a sit-in in the Capitol building on the night that Republicans tried to ram through legislation. And that sit-in wound up sparking what came to be known popularly as the Wisconsin Uprising. And the uprising was this beautiful, like life-changing experience for me. You know, just ongoing protests of up to 200,000 people at the Capitol building over and over and over again, week after week after week, in the snow and the cold, people like flooding the building, sleeping there overnight. We would bus people there and sleep overnight. And as well as that, it was rallies and protests and marches and direct actions across towns and cities all over Wisconsin. So people started taking it out elsewhere, right? So it was a statewide protest. It was happening everywhere. And so in addition to regularly busing our members to the Capitol and organizing direct actions there, as well as in Milwaukee, because we were trying to, you know, to make it something that was everywhere, we voted on a resolution to strike if another union agreed to do so, and conducted a strike assessment that determined our membership would be willing to strike if another union in the state would do the same. And we wanted to do it with another union for protection as well as effectiveness, right? And what we figured is that other unions would join in, you know, that they would come on board once we started doing something too, just like they had done after the sit-in, because that's when people just started flooding the Capitol and taking action. And it, like I said, it was the most profound, moving experience of my life. I like to say that it's like more uplifting than religion and sexier than sex. You know, there's just bodies everywhere, you know, people doing everything together. However, it showed me too that despite the beauties of that uprising, that protest alone often isn't enough, and that striking, which for me means disrupting the economic incentive that is the only thing that those in power really truly care about, is our most effective tool for winning when the stakes are high. So not only did the Republicans eventually pass legislation, the legislation that they intended, but they wound up successfully doing so in some other states down the line. And so we feel like if any other union had conducted a strike assessment, that we might have wound up with a different outcome in the uprising. We were all taken kind of by surprise, right? Nobody had pre-planned for this. So that was a lesson that we learned from this, and that I am here to share with others. And I would say that without the strike, you know, as that like escalation tactic, no matter how big it was, we couldn't get it to reach the real sort of crux of power that we needed it to. And so the voice of the people could only go so far in that instance.
Thank you, Dawn. I think I heard you say, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. So we should be ready, getting ready right now, so we're not blindsided. And thank you for being really honest about the limitations of protest, especially when there aren't masses of people in the street, right? So thank you. Okay, question to you, Zach. What are we gonna do when if Trump steals the election?
That's a good question. And thanks again for having me here. What Dawn was just saying about how that we need to do something more than just protest, and that protests aren't just enough, talking about the power of workers. I'm reminded from a line in a book that I'm quite fond of called Reviving the Strike by Joe Burns. He says in there that compared to the way that a lot of unions in more recent decades have conducted themselves and taken action on the whole, that to traditional trade unionists, the point of the strike was to make the employer's pocketbook bleed. What I get from that is that along the line of thinking about what workers and unions can do to take action is that a strike isn't just like any other protest. It's not just about raising issues or raising consciousness or just being in the streets, but it's about concretely disrupting the flow of things. There's another term that Burns uses in that book about making clear that he's talking about a production halting strike rather than just some symbolic show of force. And so that said, part of why I'm here and what I want to talk about is I draw a great amount of inspiration from the pages of labor history. In addition to being a fourth generation waterfront worker and growing up in an ILWU family, learning about people and events like Harry Bridges, the San Francisco General Strike, and Bloody Thursday, I also had the good fortune of getting to go to school and study labor history. And when I was first getting started in Denver, Colorado, actually was when the whole thing Wisconsin went down, and I went to a major rally at the Capitol building there. And it was this profoundly transformative moment for me too. So I want to thank Don in particular for being here. Like, that was deeply inspirational for me. But what I'm here to talk about tonight is this idea about looking to labor's past to try to make sense about what to do right now. I don't believe that history repeats itself. We're in a lot of uncertain times. This whole year has been a trip for everybody. But when we're talking about going into uncharted territory like we are now, with who knows what's going to happen with this election, I think studying labor's history and labor's past can not just be inspiring, but illuminating, and that other workers have taken action before and have done things like taken action on the job for political ends. And when you have something of a roadmap, even if it's just partial, it's not quite as scary. You're not going out just on a leap of faith, but that you have some certainty that other people have done this before and we can do it again. And I hope that we don't have to. I hope that the landslide, that the election is just a landslide and Trump packs it up and goes home. But if not, we've got to be ready. So let's get ready.
Great. And I heard you talk about political education a lot, which I think is so important. But can you say more about the radical history or the political actions that ILWU has taken, your own union?
Sure. So for folks who don't know, the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, principally represents dock workers and warehouse workers on the West Coast in Alaska and Hawaii and Canada. We come out of a moment that's in a lot of ways not too different from the time that we're in now. We were born out of the great waterfront, the West Coast waterfront strike of 1934 during a period of intense social and political and economic unrest. And were founded by people who were pretty openly radical about their politics, ex-Wobblies, other labor radicals, and members or fellow travelers of the American Communist Party, and the impact of those people who led that strike in 34 and founded this new union left a mark. Part of that being that when we came out of the big strike in 1934, we had a firm commitment to an all-inclusive anti-racist version of industrial unionism. One of the first big actions that we took in the course of that strike was voluntarily desegregating the union and thus the waterfront. And shortly thereafter began an aggressive campaign to organize warehouse workers down the supply line, or through the logistics network, as you probably call it today, as both a pragmatic and strategic orientation about building power with the workers who are the next closest to us, like in the warehouses that fed cargo to the waterfront, but also in a moral sense, a commitment to an injury to one is an injury to all, that we had established ourselves as a power on the docks and had an obligation to leverage that power to help and uplift other workers. Like I said, though, that a lot of the people that helped found this union were very open about their politics. And it wasn't too long before people started expressing that in other ways beyond just like conventional bread and butter or trade union issues, not just boycotting cargo in solidarity with an organizing drive or a different union, but true to what was going on in the 1930s and also not too different from what's going on right now, there was the rise of fascism. And so West Coast longshoremen started boycotting ships that were flying under the swastika when the Italian fascist government was invading Ethiopia. We boycotted cargo that we knew was going to be turned into war materials in 1939. in San Francisco and Coos Bay, our women's auxiliary, like the wives and daughters of longshoremen, set up community picket lines to boycott the export of scrap metal to Imperial Japan that we knew was going to be used to be turned into bombs and dropped onto Chinese civilians. We very openly opposed Japanese internment during the course of the war, and up through into the 1960s. We're very closely aligned with Dr. King and the civil rights movement. I believe our union's founder Bridges even threatened to boycott Alabama cargo when King was in Birmingham jail in the early 1960s. And during the course of like the rise of right-wing military regimes in Central America, or in South America and Latin America broadly, like in Chile and El Salvador, but also across the ocean, the Philippines and South Korea, also boycotted cargo that was bound for those countries as well. And up into the 1990s, we had a one-day shutdown in solidarity with Mumia Abu-Jamal, demanding his release to be taken off of death row and his release from prison. We very famously shut down on May Day, or International Workers' Day, in 2008 in protest of the war in Iraq. I think that might make us the only union in US history that's ever struck against a war. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's what I've been told. And more recently, we shut it down for Juneteenth, just a couple of months ago in June. But the biggest action, of course, is the ILWU and specifically Local 10's action in solidarity with the struggle against the apartheid regime in South Africa. That goes all the way back to community pickets that first started in 1962, but a lot of like community organizing and education that was led by rank and file dock workers throughout the Bay Area. The pinnacle of this was the 11-day boycott of the Ned Lloyd Kimberly, which is a ship that called on San Francisco Bay, where dock workers in November of 1984 refused to handle South African cargo for a whole 11 days. There's these massive raucous picket lines that erupted in solidarity with that action. And it left a profound impact on not just like the emerging BDS movement in the Bay Area and the United States, but this went all the way across to South Africa. When Nelson Mandela was finally released from prison after 27 years, he did a big tour of the United States where he spoke in a bunch of major cities where specific BDS actions had taken place, and capped it off with a massive rally at the Oakland Coliseum in front of 60,000 people with another million or two watching on TV, and specifically highlighted the actions of ILWU Local 10 about helping to build the anti-apartheid movement into what it became in the United States, and ultimately putting the kind of pressure on the government to set him free. And so, yeah, like the idea of a political strike or political job actions, I think is something of an anomaly and a rarity in US history, but it's not impossible. And we're not the only ones to do it either, but it can be done.
Thank you, Zack, for sharing that. I am over here so excited and just reminded that this is a fight not only against fascism, y'all, but this is a fight against white supremacy for the soul of this nation. And so if your union activity or your coworker activity is not intersectional, if you're not talking about all those issues, then we got to change that, because we got to get as many people out as possible to be together on this issue. And that means broadening to include all of those fights that are all intertwined: the fight against capitalism, the fight against white supremacy, the fight against fascism, the fight for our democracy and for our own dignity as workers. And so thank you, Zack. We all got some work to do. Okay, so I want to move to Sara now and ask about, what lessons do you think did we learn from the government shutdown strike threat? What do we take from that we can bring into this moment?
So I could probably take a whole hour and a half, but okay, our union had always been very aware that any government shutdown was a disruption to our work, that people that we count on every single day are thrust into uncertainty. This oftentimes happens sort of out of a real public discourse because no government shutdown had ever gone longer than 16 days before. And so there had only been a paycheck missed by a couple days, and it just hadn't risen to the same level of national awareness, really. But we had always been very aware that this was very disruptive to the workers that are government workers who we count on directly for our work. And so when this started, this was also concerning because this shutdown was over building a wall to, I think, keep us in, actually, not to keep people out. But it was over. It was over a moral issue and a question of our democracy, frankly, and a question of who we are as a nation, and also an issue of defining that our president is a white supremacist. And so this was concerning because this was not your typical political standoff, right? And there were different motives, and so we started to define what the problems were, because you always have to define what's at stake in order for people to pay attention and rally around an issue. So we started to define the issues with safety and security in air travel. I personally was at home asking, would anyone care if I didn't eat, went on a hunger strike? Would anyone care if I chained myself to the Capitol? I mean, just like going through all of this. And finally, it became very clear to me as we were approaching Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday celebration, and I was actually being presented an award from the AFL-CIO for the awards dinner, that there was an opportunity to talk about the kind of power that we had to stand up to the fact that our government had locked out 2 million people and forced hundreds of thousands of people to come to work for free. And this was a crisis that everyone should be able to identify with. And what the conclusion that I came to in that moment was that the only option that we had was a strike. And when I started to say strike privately, people said, well, first of all, people got excited, right, internally. But once I started to say it out loud, people started to say, isn't that kind of dangerous that you're saying that? You shouldn't say strike. You're going to scare people. And, my response to both labor leaders and academics was strike, 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 strike. Say it. It feels good. And I have actually learned since that moment that we are scared of this word, and we have to start saying it all the time, because this is not a scary thing. This is our power. And so it was really extraordinary. I gave that speech on a Sunday night. The shutdown didn't end until the following Friday. So I gave that speech in front of 1,000 union activists, intersectionally minded union activists, I should say. And they, it was talked about, but it didn't really get out into the public consciousness until 4 days later, when I gave a speech at National Airport and never even mentioned the word strike, but defined what was at stake in that moment. And I should just also let you know that, and that speech went viral. And then people picked up on the general strike speech, because when they went to our page, that was what we had flashing everywhere. So they connected the two, even though I hadn't said strike in the other. All I had done was define what was at stake that couldn't go on a minute longer. And then the solution, of course, is the strike. People immediately make that connection. And the very next day, after we had defined that, we had defined what was at stake, and we had defined what we were willing to do to stop it. And so the very next day, before we could even because we were getting ready to take a strike vote, the flight attendants, we weren't just calling for a general strike for everyone. We were calling for everyone to talk about a general strike, but we were actually getting ready to strike ourselves as a union. And so the very next day was when they missed the second paycheck. And of course, only 10 air traffic controllers famously called in sick because they could no longer do the job with all the stress and do it safely. And that caused such a logjam that flights stopped at LaGuardia. And 2 hours later, after the day previously, there had been a vote to continue this government shutdown. 2 hours later, there was a deal. And, you know, we were like right on top of that and keeping that strike at the front of people's minds. I mean, we got a statement out right away. Mitch McConnell, can you hear us now? And I just want to let you know, well, a lot of people were calling that Trump shutdown. We didn't use his name one time because we realized that what this man wanted was all the power and all the control. When we understood earlier in that week that he didn't care if the air traffic controllers didn't go to work. He didn't care if the TSA officers stopped showing up for work because he wanted to privatize everything. And if suddenly these government functions weren't working, it was his excuse to privatize it. So they also could not strike themselves. They needed that solidarity from the private sector to support them. And he also didn't care if there was an accident, because people in chaos say, make it stop. They're begging for a change. And so the capitalists know that if they bring you to a moment of chaos, there's my likelihood that people are willing to go along with whatever solution is given to just stop the pain, right? And so in either case, if we didn't stop this was not a normal political assessment. And we had to shut it down. And what stopped that government shutdown was not the fact that we actually all did strike, because it was only a few flights. It was the analysis that workers were going to have a taste of our power and we were going to take over everything once we did. And so they shut down that so fast before we could really understand our power as workers, because this was going to turn into a massive strike. It was going to. And that was the last thing they could allow to happen. So we have to understand the power in that word, in that tactic, but that our power is really our solidarity and understanding what is common that we have at stake, defining that really well, understanding that together, and then looking each other in the eye, like Dawn was saying, you know, getting that commitment with another union to say, I've got your back, and you feel that solidarity bouncing off of one another, and all of a sudden you start to feel that power and you start to feel that you can do something that no one thought you could do moments before. And so that's what we have to build for. That's what I've learned. But it all starts with not being afraid to talk about where our power lies. And I just want to know, Zack, I love that you quoted Joe Burns. He is, of course, our director of collective bargaining. And so I work with Joe Burns every day. And I should just note that Joe Burns is responsible for closing out 5 contracts since COVID started. So it's not always just about the strike. It's about getting results for workers. We got results for workers, got money in people's pockets right now, believe it or not. And I just also want to note that this is where I start any problem that I have, or almost every single day, is this quote with Mother Jones. And she said, the capitalists say there is no need of labor organizing, but the fact that they themselves are continually organizing shows their real beliefs. The capitalists want the most labor for the least money. The laborers want the most money for the least labor. Workers produce wealth and build the world's palaces, but they neither use the wealth nor dwell in the palaces. If you would only realize that you hold the solution of the whole problem in your own hands, you could settle the whole question easily. If, for instance, instead of striking in small groups, every industry in America were to hold up, the capitalists would be obliged to yield to any and all demands, for the world could simply not go on. And when the planes stopped, when COVID started, we had tremendous power because we're 80% organized in the airline industry. And the airline industry had to come to us for help because they couldn't do it alone. And so they had to agree to a relief package where we told them exactly how they could spend the money. And the money could only be spent on us to keep us in our jobs, connected to our healthcare, and keep service going to all of the communities rather than driven by a capitalist market. And so that is what we designed because we had the power. And in that moment, we understood in chaos, when we understood that we had that power, we could exercise that and make the capitalists bend to our demands. So there you go.
Thank you, Sarah, talking about that power. It's so important. It's so true that once workers organizing experience that power, it's contagious and you can't forget that experience, and you just feel so much more capable of stepping out and fighting and taking a chance and taking a risk and being willing to, act collectively when you experience that power. It's so important. So thank you for that. I also just want to really quickly plug that Tristan is putting a link in the chat for people who are interested in organizing in their own workplaces. So look out for that in the chat. We are going to move on to Dawn. So we've heard all this amazing anecdotes and stories about, workers and logistics, like on the airlines or on the waterfronts and the docks, who are able to exercise their power for political change and to get, real working class conditions improved. So Dawn, what do you see of the role is for people who don't have those kind of logistical jobs? What do you see the role of those workers, and how are they able to inspire action in Wisconsin where you are?
Well, I'm not in Wisconsin now, but the role of other workers is to disrupt wherever they can in any way they can, even if their work sites aren't part of the basic infrastructure of the country. But I think we also, need as many of them as possible to be disrupting the delivery of goods and services in any kind of way. And we need the oligarchs to see that they can't get away with their plans because the people simply will not perform their jobs. People need to walk out of their jobs with their coworkers and fill the streets. If the message we send is business as usual, then fill the streets at night, there's a strong chance that the wrong people will still win. So, I think that people typically don't think of grad unions as heavy hitters. They're not, we're not the airline industry, which is why it's so great to have Sara on here talking about, the big heavy hitters. But it was grad workers who were at the front of organizing action in Wisconsin. Remember, it was TAA who staged that sit-in that then sparked everybody else coming out. I think it's possible that workers, whether or not they're unionized in work sites that aren't considered heavy hitters or critical to infrastructure, will be helpful to sparking something that others can join. And we need people to take action regardless of who starts it. We need action everywhere. We need to be united in saying no to fascism. And so an example of the type of thing that people can do, so in the union that I'm a staff for, we are going to be introducing a resolution that says we'll take whatever action necessary if another union in the system agrees to do the same, the Illinois system that we're in. So again, we're going to be talking to other groups about this. And then I wanted to share with you some resolutions and pledges that people have been issuing recently. So for instance, the Rochester Labor Council passed a resolution stating that they call on the national AFL-CIO, all of its union affiliates, and all other labor organizations to prepare for and enact a general strike of all working people. The Seattle Education Association passed a resolution stating that in the event of an interference in the federal election, it would call within a week special meetings of its leadership bodies to recommend work actions to be voted on by the membership. The American Postal Workers Union in Detroit warned its members to be prepared to resist a coup and put a leaflet to its membership calling on them to take a pledge that reads, "We will vote, we will refuse to accept election results until all the votes are counted. We will non-violently take to the streets if a coup is attempted. If we need to, we will shut this country down to protect the integrity of the democratic process." So, there are all sorts of things that people can do, and talking to each other, talking to other people around them, talking to other work sites, even if you're not unionized, just talking to people who are doing what you're doing, and a plan of action of some sort. And so hopefully those things are, examples and inspiring to people.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so Zack, this question is for you. We talked earlier about the long history of ILWU taking political action on the job, but I wonder if you can say more about how you talk to your coworkers about political issues. Particularly, I imagine that new people come in all the time, and so how do you get them engaged around these types of issues? Walk us through that conversation.
Sure, and I think that's a great point, that knowing this history, knowing what to do with it, while if you do know it, it's really helpful and useful and inspiring. You can't take that for granted, and that these kinds of things don't just fall into place and happen just because this happens to be our history. So to emphasize this point about having like one-on-one organizing conversations with your coworkers, that you constantly have to be organizing even when you are already like very well established and really well organized. Like we've been organized on the waterfront in Tacoma since 1886, but there's still like always work to be done. But that said, in my experience, I feel like it's really helpful to have such an exciting and radical history, and that kind of does the work for me a lot of the time. Like I said earlier, that when you don't have to ask people to go out on such a leap of faith, but you can say like, well, Harry Bridges did this in like the 1930s, or some longshoremen in San Francisco did this in 1984, or we just did it a couple of years ago in 2008. It's not as hard to convince people, right? That it's like, it's real, like it's been shown that it can be done, that you can get away with it, that you can make change. And so for me, labor education and labor history is a huge part of my organizing, right? But that said too, like actually like turning specifically to what those kinds of conversations look like and those efforts, like I mentioned, like the first community boycott against South African cargo in San Francisco was all the way back in 1962. And it wasn't until 1984 that there was actual like work stoppages around it. And there's a lot of community organizing in between that time, like all throughout like the 1970s, right? And so even with like a radical tradition, and especially for Local 10 in San Francisco, the ILWU, that has like the most overtly radical political traditions in our union, those things didn't just like fall into place. And those guys had to agitate, they had to educate, they had to organize around them for years and years and years before that action actually finally came together. And then it paid off big, right? But that said, as I believe Sara mentioned earlier, like, I don't know how much time we really have. Like the election is in 2 weeks. We don't have all the time in the world to just sit around and talk about labor history and have all the organizing conversations and structure tests that we want to do and all the rest of it. Sometimes really big things like happen really, really fast. A great example of that is, like I mentioned, like the San Francisco general strike in 1934. Like a couple people got murdered by the police in the course of that strike. Like we'd already been out on strike for months and months. But when it happened, like the entire Bay Area got in line. I think over like 128 different unions all voted to go on strike in solidarity with us and shut down the entirety of San Francisco and much of the surrounding Bay Area. And so that's not to say that that was a spontaneous thing or that it just came out of nowhere, but sometimes big things can happen really fast. But along the lines of what Don was saying too, that while flight attendants and longshore workers do have really unique forms of leverage and power, access to choke points in the logistics chain, we shouldn't lose sight of that. And that stuff is important for us to be thinking about our organizing. But I would hate to, I don't know, to sell other workers short or suggest that other working people don't have other forms of power, right? Like that would be ridiculous. And that said, it's like, it just comes down to having these kinds of conversations and being able to convince people that they like can and should take action and it can be done. And our history shows us that.
Thanks for that, Zach. Don, your union underwent, or you all did a strike assessment when you were preparing to go out. Can you talk us through what that was like? As Zach and Sara both mentioned, now is not the time for structured tests or political education. We're right on the line here, so we may not have time to go through all of those union meetings and everything, but it is important to have, you do need to assess and see who's with you and who's not with you. So I'm wondering if, Don, you could talk us through the process that you all went through, and how did you comfort or reassure coworkers who were nervous about taking an action like the one that you all were looking to take?
Sure, and I will say too that we did this all very quickly, and that it was sped up by the sort of crisis of the moment too. There was a lot of energy and a sense of urgency. So first we held a membership meeting, people freely expressed their concerns there because there is a lot of fear, understandably, although a lot of it is also, as Sara pointed out, unnecessary too, right? Because that's the thing we need to get beyond in order to be able to do what we have to do. So there were voices in favor who said the outcome of striking was less fearful than the risks of taking action. And so it was good for those people who had, the concerns to hear that. And then our leaders explained the risks of political strikes, but emphasized the power and safety in numbers. And so that's also part of why we did our assessment, right? So like, we're going to do this together. We will be protected by doing this together and with others. So others will be doing this in other locations. And so after that, we phone banked all of the roughly 1,000 members not at the meeting. And we had a system that, volunteers who were set up to do that, gave them the phone numbers, and we agitated them around the issues and gave them a vision to win. Because if you just ask people if they want to do something, they say no, right? But if you agitate them about what they care about what's at stake, and help them see that there's something even bigger than their fear that's at stake, and help them understand how it is that you can win and that you'll be safe together, then they say yes. So we explained that our ability to maintain our union was at stake, that Republicans wanted to destroy unions because they're a check on the elite's ability to accumulate wealth, and that unions tend to support politically left candidates. We explained that these plans were drawn up by a right-wing think tank with Wisconsin as a testing grounds, which were ultimately intended to further consolidate power nationally in the hands of oligarchs. So this was something that was both about our specific immediate needs, as well as the larger political projects that people care about, right? And about our rights collectively, even once people weren't in this union. And we said that if our union went on strike along with another union, others would join us in striking, just as they had joined the protest at the Capitol. And hopefully we could together bring the state to a halt. At the end, we asked if people would be willing to participate in a strike if there was majority interest. So again, we were conveying, we're doing this together, right? It's not just gonna be a few of us who go out. We're doing it together. And then we tracked the yes and no responses in a spreadsheet, which sounds very businessy, but we had to know where people were. And then, and it also helped us understand where our power was, because we have different work sites. So where is our power concentrated? And that's helpful, especially too, for those who might be doing minority strikes, because if it's concentrated in particular places, you can still pull it off if that's where the leverage is. Our leaders talked to fellow leaders and rank and file members of other unions and asked them to consider striking too. And this is all stuff that we really should have done beforehand a little more. But like I said, a lot of people were sort of surprised. And so this is something that I think could have gone very differently. And that's why I'm here speaking about our experience, because I think it can go differently in the future. And it's great to have Sara and Zack here talking about the experiences of actions that they have taken. And those are models for all of us.
Yes, thank you, Dawn. And we all need to do assessments and have a list, build a list. Yes. Okay, so I want to turn to you now, Sara. Some unions are starting to talk about the potential for strikes if Trump does try to steal the election. What do you think the role of labor should be to stop Trump's plans, if that's so? And more specifically, can you say what we should be doing over the next week? Like, what are some concrete things that we should be doing to prepare for this for the next week that we can start tomorrow?
Well, it's very interesting because, Mother Jones' quote about the capitalists are always organizing. Boy, I see that all the time. And the fact that we did not have a relief bill, by the way, I won't call it a stimulus because we're in the middle of a crisis right now. It's relief for people. This is not a stimulus of any kind. We're not stimulating anything. We actually are just not even willing to talk about wearing masks. So anyway, we really should have had this relief bill in the summer. Not allowed those unemployment plus up payments to lapse, the protections against evictions, all of the rest, and all of the relief that people needed. But this has gone on. And last week, we got a real lesson when Trump tweeted out he's calling off the negotiations, and 6 hours later singled out the airlines as the one thing that he wanted to pass. And I said, I think on MSNBC or somewhere, that was a lot like in the movie Norma Ray, so that people could visualize this. When the boss is seeing that Norma Ray is starting to agitate and starting to organize people, and so let's quick make her a supervisor so that everybody hates her and we take her out of the game, right? So I do think it's very interesting that that we were singled out. and that it essentially stopped that relief from getting in place. And that tonight I'm here telling you that I am spending every waking moment right now trying to shore up my union, because half of my union is out of work right now. Half. No paycheck, no health care. In the middle of a pandemic, after having been on the front lines of this since the beginning. So right now, I know that I have to show our members that we are fighting for them and their jobs. Nothing is more immediate for people than just being able to simply provide for themselves and their families, right? And it is the thing that is going to get their attention the fastest. And it is often what we're talking with them about why they want to strike, to improve those conditions, right? That's typically why we're talking about a strike. So we have to win. I want to shore up my union so we're strong enough to fight forward, frankly. And I know what a strategic industry we are and what a choke point we are, and what a role we can play here. But so do the other people playing this game, clearly. And so we are trying to lock this in, save people's jobs, save people's healthcare. And we can't stop fighting for a second on that. And even if we don't win here, even if we don't succeed, because Mother Jones also said, you will fight and win, fight and lose, but you must fight. And she said that to the people after the Ludlow massacre. Well, imagine saying that to people who just watched little children burn and little boys get shot in the back, and their entire community having fought together, speaking 28 different languages, but understanding they were in a common cause, be murdered. She said, you must fight. And so people have to know that you're going to fight, but you do also have to win. And so what we need to be doing right now is coming together and spreading the word that we must fight. We must fight for all Americans. We have to shore this up. We have to fight right now for relief right now, because the fights that are coming ahead, we need to get $2 trillion out into people's pockets. But if we don't get that done, people need to understand which side they're on and who's on their side and who they're fighting with and who they're fighting against. And so for me, this is my focus right now. It's a shared experience across the country. And what we need to be doing to lock in this relief bill is critical for the fights forward. And if we are all taking part in that and coming out for Relief Now actions and locking this in, this is going to be a large part of building the broad-based support for the fact that it's working people who take care of each other, working people who demand that our government work for us, respond to us. And by the way, when we say that this government doesn't do anything and it's not worth our time, we are giving them permission to do nothing. And we can't do that. So that's where my head is right now, because we have to understand what our common cause is. And right now, this is a common cause for all Americans.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Dawn for a PSA. And then we're going to take about 15 minutes to ask some questions of the panelists.
So as one of the volunteers on EWOC who helps non-unionized workers organize and take action, I'm here to now ask you, do you want to take the next step and start talking to your coworkers about the election and the role workers play? So if so, fill out the form that I believe Tristan is dropping in the chat right now, and we'll connect you with an organizer who can help you. And for those who want to donate to support the work that EWOC does, we're also going to drop a donation link in the chat. And I would say to go ahead and open both of those links now so that they're still open when you close things later. When you close out the chat, it's not going to be there. And while you're doing that, I'm going to leave you with a quote from Francis Fox Piven, who wrote that workers had the most influence and ability to extract concessions from government during the early years of the Great Depression, before they were even organized into unions. Their power came not from the organization itself, but from the sharp need they felt and their ability to translate that need into strikes that disrupted the financial bottom line that the wealthy and the politicians who represent them care about. And we know here at EWOC that what we're all facing is big, and EWOC is here to support you all on the steps you take. We have the chance to make history together. It won't be easy, but it will be life-changing.
Yes, thank you, Dawn. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get into these questions. They're not for any panels in specific, so whoever wants to take, and if several of you would like to chime in, we definitely have time for that. So the first question is from Terry Weeks. The question says, I wholeheartedly support a general strike. However, I'm a hospice RN, and with dying patients and their families relying on me, I do not think I can strike. Do you have thoughts on how I can fit into this movement? And that's for any of the panelists.
Yeah, first of all, Bianca, I just want to go back and make sure that people know that after Mother Jones did say you must fight, mine workers from other states and all over the state came to Ludlow and chased the militia out and formed their own government for a period of time. This is often not a not often told part of that history that happened, that solidarity that happened, where they rushed to help their sisters and brothers, and ultimately spurred on organizing that built the mine workers to be the most powerful union in America and birthed the rest of the labor movement, alongside AFL-CIO, I should say. And so, you know, I think that we all have a role to play. And we have to understand that when we are defining that we're taking this strike so that we can have a functioning democracy and a government that is taking care of its people rather than attacking its people, that there are going to be people who need to continue to do the jobs that they're doing. And so those people can make it very clear that that's what this is about, that this is about continuing to take care of people. Now, what are the other ways that you can support? You can talk to your friends and families about what you're doing. You can point them to the actions. You can ask them to talk with their coworkers about actions in their workplaces. You can also donate your time after work and your time and your money to the cause for the people who are standing up. So there are a lot of different roles that you can play, even if your job is defined by the workers, by those of us workers and strikers taking action as essential work. Not our government defining us as essential workers and wanting to take advantage of us and pay us less to be essential workers, but workers ourselves recognizing that we are doing this to take care of each other. And so there has to be that kind of structure, and there has to be that kind of definition to say that we are going to continue the basic functions of the society, but we are going to act as the government now. I hope.
That's great. No, I just wanted to make sure, see if anybody wanted to add anything to that. That's great, Sarah. Thank you.
I was just going to say real quick, I saw some people mention this in the comments, but like I mentioned the San Francisco general strike earlier. There were exemptions to that, like the people like on the general strike committee made exemptions for milk and bakery delivery drivers, for example, and of course also like hospitals. And so like Sarah said, there's lots of other ways to participate in a general strike or any kind of like strike and labor activity. Even if you're a healthcare worker and feel like you can't go on strike with them, like shouldn't feel guilty about it. And there's plenty of other things to be doing too. Like one-on-one organizing conversations with your patients and your coworkers too.
Awesome, yeah. Great, so the next question is from Devin Kelly. The question is, while I agree 100% with everything the speakers are saying about economic action if Trump tries to steal the election, I'm also curious about what we do if Biden wins outright. Then there is still a wave of right-wing or white supremacist violence. What is the role of economic disruption then, or will it be more about mass mobilization?
That's a great question, and I do want to point out that the grad union at University of Michigan took a political strike in part over racial justice, and it was, you know, political strikes are these illegal strikes, and that was really inspiring to me. And I'd love to see more of that, and to see people doing it in unity, so it has more power, that they're coordinating around it, like all the unions on a campus doing it together, for instance. And I know right now on my campus, we have what we've labeled the Good Justice Coalition. And so it's a coalition of unions and student organizations across campus. And we are organizing around demands that were authored by Black students, to win those demands for the entire campus. And so we want to dismantle the police on campus. You know, we want to see more faculty of color hired. We want to see more trauma-informed therapists. So these are things we're fighting for in coalition. It would be great if we can get to the point where a stronger action becomes part of winning that.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next question from Donald Rhodes. It says, should we be thinking about economically strategic locations for strikes or protest activity in our cities? For instance, airports or the stock market or highways? Or do you think visibility or symbolic locations are likely to be more effective locations for protests?
Well, I think if we can be organized and pull it off, I think about our strike tactic, which is chaos, create havoc around our system, that we created in the early 90s because we were coming off of the TWA strike and Carl Icahn just simply replacing all the flight attendants overnight, and thousands of flight attendants being out of work with replacement workers for years on end. And so that had been the playbook for airline management to break any strike of airline workers, but definitely flight attendants who they could train and certify within a couple days' time and have a workforce up and running. So, so we created chaos, which is a legal form of strike under the Railway Labor Act, intermittent strikes. And we did this at Alaska Airlines without having this tested in the courts. And we struck only 7 flights. So when we first hit the strike deadline, we said that we could strike anywhere at any time. And management emptied its management ranks from the building, put everybody out on planes in case they had to leap into action and go to work and replace those flight attendants. And so we completely disrupted their operation without even striking 1 flight. And bookings also fell by 20%, just because people were concerned it might be their flight that was hit. So when they finally called, they didn't think we were going to do it. They thought we were bluffing. They called management back to headquarters, and then we struck our first flight. 1 flight for 3 flight attendants. And, you know, it went crazy. Now, if you think about the airline industry, flights cancel every day. This wasn't actually about the economic harm of that 1 flight. It was the threat of the strike, and strategically placing, we got to decide when and where. We controlled the schedule. We took total control from management. And we only had to strike 6 more flights before they illegally suspended and fired some of the strikers. And we went for an injunction. We got a ruling in our favor. And that night they wanted to settle the contract over fax machines. So they agreed to a contract where they screwed up and they gave the flight attendants a 60% raise. Okay. So they were so crazed and wanted to get control of the operation again so badly that they agreed to this without even wanting to meet. So we have used that tactic ever since and said that chaos is our brand of strike. And I mean, as I have tried to strike so many times in my life, but we can't strike because they don't ever want to face this. In fact, at US Airways, the president of the company was quoted on the front page of the USA Today. We will shut down the airline rather than subject our passengers to the phenomenon called chaos. And ultimately, they settled that contract at the midnight strike deadline too, midnight strike / lockout. And so I think that if we can control when and where, and we think about how we can strategically place pressure in places that are going to have a major impact, we actually don't have to have a general strike across the entire country. we can have a major impact if we know that we can shut down one specific place. And it doesn't even have to be for a very long period of time. If we take control of the schedule of the country, we can have a tremendous effect. And we do have to think about, I think, sure, Wall Street, but it's what they expect, right? So, shutting down a major highway or shutting down a specific airport, or, there's things that we can do that we can be very organized about and very thorough about, and actually probably a lot of tactics that I'm not even gonna talk about here. A lot of things run through my head, but if we are organized and we can communicate with each other very quickly, and we create a structure where we have leaders in all these locations and we can get that communication out quickly, we could actually create a lot of havoc and show them that we're controlling the country without having to have even a sustained strike everywhere. And Wall Street's boring.
Noted for those of us in New York City. Thank you so much for that. We did have some questions about, whether or not we should be waiting on leadership of the large parent unions and the AFL-CIO, for instance, to give us directions about what to do, whether it's worth it to do that. Are they preparing anything? But we don't have time for that question. So I put it out there so that you can incorporate that into your closing remarks if you'd like. Let's go ahead and start with Zack. Yes, closing remarks, Zack.
I'll just say to that point, getting unions and AFL and state labor councils on your side, that would be great. I'm not going to get my hopes up about it. So don't wait for it. Don't expect that and don't wait for it. Last thing I guess I'll say is I want to reemphasize this point about we all got a lot of work to do. We all got a lot of organizing in our workplaces and our communities that we need to be doing, not just in these 2 weeks, but really organizing for the long haul around a whole lot of issues. I think a lot of people are aware of this, but just in case you're not, close to 90% of the US workforce doesn't have a union. So if you want to get serious about your politics and making change in the world, take them to work. Go get a union job, or even better yet, organize one where there isn't already. We got to organize the unorganized, and we're not going to be able to have the kind of mass power to really change things until we get there. So don't hesitate. Call a union in your area, call these EWOC organizers, join DSA. Let's get rowdy, let's get buck. So that's all I got.
Thank you, Zack. Dawn.
Yeah, so to echo what Zack just said, let everybody know about EWOC. Let that 90% of the country know about EWOC so we can help you. And the other thing I would say is, again, like Frances Fox Piven pointed out, most of the concessions are wrested from government when people weren't even in unions. So non-unionized workers can take concerted action and they can be effective. And so that's what we all need to be doing and figuring out how we can best do it within our particular work site.
I think a lot of times we take for granted that we have a labor movement already. It just needs to be ignited. And there are a lot of amazing local leaders out there who have incredibly well-organized locals. And so don't take for granted that, well, let me say this too. I know there's an emergency meeting coming up, so I'm not fully prepared to even answer that question, because I might take part in a great discussion on national level. That's a possibility. But what I would say is exactly what Zack said. Don't wait, and make those local connections, but tap into that and find out where you have the leaders who are interested in moving an organized and mobilized labor movement, and where you've got transactional stuff going on that maybe you just want to organize around. So yeah, don't wait, but also don't leave out the 14 million people who are already in unions today. Because I think a lot of times we fall into the trap of talking about the labor movement based on a handful of leaders at a national level, when the truth is there's amazing organizing and good work going on in these locals, and we have to lift that up and we have to give that voice, and we also have to engage that and make the connections locally so that we can really build a movement from the ground up.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Zach. All of the panelists. I think tonight was phenomenal. I want to really quickly, in closing, shout out the Labor Action to Defend Democracy. It's a network of unions and worker centers organizing to fight against a potential Trump coup. If your organization wants to be plugged in, you can fill out the link that is just being dropped in the chat right now to join that. And I also want to shout out again, one more time, the hashtag Relief Now. We're asking, AFA needs our help. We're asking all members of Congress to agitate for a relief bill prior to the election, and lifting up hashtag Relief Now and hashtag Everyday Count social media posts. I also want to send a special solidarity, speaking of coups, to our comrades in Bolivia who have been victorious this week. Socialism did win. Solidarity to them. I also want to send solidarity to our comrades who are fighting in both Chile for a new constitution and right now on the ground in Nigeria against state violence and for the right to love who they love and have and marry who they love. And so I want us to be mindful about those struggles happening around the globe. We all as socialists believe in a global struggle against capitalism and a global uprising of working people. And so the media won't show you those things, but I encourage you to research it on social media and figure out ways that you can uplift the messages from our comrades all across the world. And with that, I'll close and just say thank you, everyone, and have a good night.